This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to yet another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's me, your girl BK, and joined with me is the lovely, the extraordinary, manly Jack Manley. How you doing today, Jack?
You know, okay, all things considered. We had a very freakish kind of snow earlier, and now it's gloomy outside, and I guess that gloom is going to get us ready to be in the mood for this film today, BK.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. It is very odd looking out right now. It's super setting the tone for the film that we are going to dive into today, and that is going to be the amazing film called The Third Man. Now, Jack, give him the deets. Who does this? What is this? When did this movie come out? Let him know.
Absolutely. This is a classic from all the way back in 1949. The Third Man is directed by Carol Reed. It was written by Greene, and it stars Joseph Cotten, Alida Valli, and Orson Welles. And BK, this is a bit of a trip for you because how old is the oldest film you had seen prior to this? Was it Psycho in 60, or had you seen other works?
Honestly, I really think Psycho is probably the oldest. I've seen snippets of Casablanca, but I don't know what was happening. So I'm going to go with that. Psycho, yes, for the podcast, is the first, I can remember, classic film I've seen and the oldest.
Okay, well, just so you know, we're filing away Casablanca now because it's a great film and it involves one of my personal loves, which is great composing from Max Steiner. So Casablanca's on the list now, BK. But I'm excited that we're getting you to go back a little bit, because this is something that has been very much my forte. It's always been really important to me personally to go back as somebody who loves film and to really see where the rudiments of style and the basis of the work we see today, where all of that really comes from and where that energy was developed. And Third Man has a lot of that energy incarnate. It's a film that gives you so much to focus on, and there's so much meat on the bone that I think it's going to be a lot of fun to go through, and I'm glad that you're here to experience it.
Yes, this is actually really cool. So for those of you listening, I know most of us, I'm actually outing you guys. It's okay. Not many of us watch older films. Not many of us watch black and white films. It's okay. BK doesn't either. But I am someone who's always going to try something once. And honestly, the plot of this got me interested. So I kind of threw it all to the side once I heard what this film is about, which means I think we got to give them the BK synopsis, Jack.
All right, and hopefully this one's going to be a little bit easier on you because we're not doing a double feature this week.
Fingers crossed. Here we go. Upon being called to post-war Vienna by his best friend to join a business venture, a drunken pulp novelist discovers that his best friend has been murdered as a part of a racketeering scheme involving an assortment of seedy characters. Pursued by these enemies and harried by an international police force and a citizenry that does not want him there, the writer must discover the secret behind the murder with the help of his friend's depressed former lover. Talk about dramatic.
That's a pretty incredible summation of the elements that are in play here. And I love that you mention the citizenry as well, because Vienna itself is a real character in this film as well. It's a very finely crafted piece that involves setting as much as performance, as much as plot. And there's just this great amalgamation of creative force in here to create something that is held up as one of the standards of film noir. But I've got a question for you, BK. What do you define film noir as? We've gone over this a little bit before with Seven and with Psycho and a couple of other films that we have looked at, but nailing down film noir is a pretty hard thing to do.
Yeah, see, you're going to send me to the doghouse, Jack. Like, for me, I think of film noir, and I'm like, okay, it's going to be a detective story. You're going to have some guy who's, like, down on his luck. Lots of drinking probably involved. Really dramatic music, low lighting, tons of low lighting, and rain in alleyways. Like, I'm just thinking of things. I realize I'm not even naming a genre. But that's what I think of when I'm like, what is noir? I'm like, yes, it's some detective story with lots of drama and romance. Boom. What is it really, Jack? Tell me.
Well, here's the thing. You're not wrong to think of those aesthetics and those tropes as emblematic of noir. Huh? It might surprise you to learn that to this day, there is still a very robust debate in circles of film criticism and film history over whether or not noir is defined as its own specific genre. For example, a lot of people who defend the argument that it is a genre point out detective tropes and things that you've mentioned in terms of settings in inner cities. And yet, there are a great number of film noirs that don't center around detectives, that are set in rural towns and cities, that focus on sort of the insidious nature of small town America as opposed to just the insidious nature of the cities. And so, there's a lot of argument, I would say, around whether or not we're going to consider it its own type of film. But the closest anyone's come to really defining it, I think, are two French critics named Raymond Bardet and Etienne Chaumeton. Now, in the 1950s, they wrote a book called A Panorama of American Film Noir. And in this work, they did their best to narrow down the characteristics of a noir film to 5 qualities that are strangeness, eroticism, cruelty, ambivalence, and having a dreamlike quality about the story. And so, BK, that's really where we're working in terms of definitions with noir. Is it a genre or not? It's very much up for debate. But those characteristics really seem to be the material that defines itself through all noir.
Okay, I see those themes. Like, now that you mention them, right, again, I'm still a noir baby, freshly born, but the things you mentioned, right, strangeness, eroticism, cruelty, ambivalence, like, very, like, dreamlike. I got a mystic vibe, but that might have a weird connotation, but I felt that when you mentioned that, and I think I could be team genre. I'm here for it. I could be team, other works just pull things from the genre. So I'm here to figure out, where does that kind of birth even come from? Where does, like, noir even begin? And how do we get to The Third Man? Because my God, Jack, this film, I want to get into it. So tell me what I need to know to be fully immersed in this, if I wasn't already before. Because let me tell you, the music, guys, like, I just have to let y'all know how to, like, put it out real quick on top. I know we ain't getting to the plot just yet, but the music sets the stage. So...
Oh, don't worry. We're going to get to the music, BK. The scoring in this film is phenomenal. But if we back it up to where noir comes from, it kind of gets to how I like to look at it. Is I don't think of it necessarily as a genre. I think of it as sort of a creative movement in the way that disciplines like painting have movements. And really, it's out of that kind of ethos and that philosophy that it originates. The movement was born cinematically, at least, through the work of the German expressionists during the 1910s and the 1920s. This was a style that emphasized a lot of stark contrasts, emphasized the brutalities of reality, and really culminated in the film that we have discussed before that we'll eventually have to watch at some point, Fritz Lang's M, which is really regarded as one of the first noir works. And it was really kind of on its own as a European noir for a while, because noir to develop was forced by the circumstances of Europe at the time over to America to really develop, because all of the German expressionists pretty much fled the moment the Nazis started taking over Europe during the 1930s.
I'm glad that you bring up like the history and the German expressionism situation, because like it is true to point this out, and I really think that it's interesting that you bring it up because I don't know too much about that specific time in history, but it is a time in history that I am interested in over others. So I'm super fascinated with this, and I do remember that, you know, all the intellects and all of them, they got the hell out of there, let's be real, or, you know, they got, to say the least. So you're saying when it formed overseas, because we're in America here, and then it came to America, it really started to kick off as its own type of thing.
Absolutely, and for the same reasons that other fields, particularly science, took off. It was because of all these German expats doing good work in the United States. While science had luminaries like Albert Einstein and Werner von Braun, on the other hand, you had these German expressionists like Michael Curtis, who was working in Hollywood from the 1920s and developed some of the earliest noirs. You had the expressionists holding crucial roles on 1930s horror films. In fact, Dracula, The Mummy, and The Black Cat were all helmed by German expressionists. So the influence of this style, of the nature of the movement, became the underpinnings of a lot of some of the juiciest material in 1930s Hollywood. The stuff that wasn't necessarily your cookie-cutter Hollywood spectacle film. The stuff that really focused in on character work at the earliest stage was the work of the German expressionists. But they were not alone in helping to create film noir, BK. Noir really was, as a movement, one of the first true amalgamations of several different artistic movements.
Okay, because I was about to say, I was like, I know there's a lot of themes in the two noir I've actually seen. I feel like I'm saying the word wrong. Noir. This is Team BK pronounces a word wrong every podcast episode now.
Everyone.
Everyone. No, but there are a lot of different themes in it. Well, like, I kind of sense that sense of tension, that sense of dramaticism, but not in a cliche type of way. So when you mentioned those early horror films, I'm like, oh yeah, I do recall Dracula. I do recall that. I guess I could see how that is in tandem or connected. You know, I never really put them together. So you're like opening my mind right now, Jack.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because it's a weird time for me personally with film study as well. My focus has always been much more grounded in the new Hollywood movement of the 60s and the independent movement of the 90s. Those are my bread and butter in terms of history. So it was a bit of an experience to step out of my box in researching for this podcast and to recognize, hey, there's a lot of traditions here that really do set the framework for why noir became such a huge and influential part of American cinema. One of the big undercurrents that came from America was our hard-boiled novels. It was a pulp tradition of writing about, you know, ill-fated characters, about crime, about the hard-nosed detective work that happened in all of these stories. And it was further informed by films like Scarface coming out and proving that the crime drama and the morally questionable protagonist were not things that were going to keep people away. Point in fact, they were going to bring people into the theater. And so that's where that uniquely American side of noir really started to develop. But it needed one more piece, and it really was found in taking influence from the French poetic realist movement within the 1920s and 1930s. Now, this film tradition, I guess, is most closely associated with, if I had to come up with one film that is emblematic of poetic realism, it would be Jean Renoir's Grand Illusion. But it shared a lot of traits with German Expressionism, which is why it could fold in, along with the hard-boiled tradition, and along with Expressionism, into this amalgamation of very cynical, dark, kind of morally onerous content.
Wow. Okay, so when I think of noir, all those detective, dark, broken hero stuff, this is what you're honing in on. This is where it came from. This like main character who always seems to be down on his luck. I don't know why I keep using that phrase, but in my head I hear the narrator going over in the midnight with the rain coming down, and you see him in his chair, empty glass, and he's like, yes, another case. face another day. That's what I think of. So this is where that came from? Am I tripping, Jack?
No, it is, and to that point, the kind of images that you're referencing really come from the banner film for noir. In 1941, John Huston released his absolute classic, The Maltese Falcon, and that film is where we get a lot of our conceptions and tropes of what we expect I hate to say it, but like stereotypical noir. The beats that we expect, the femme fatale, the seedy underbelly of the city, the morally onerous detective. All of that is really finely established in The Maltese Falcon. But 41 was a big year for noir, not just because of actual noir film. It was at that point that Orson Welles, of course, released Citizen Kane. And its stark use of shadows, its high contrast within the story, its focus on uncomfortable themes and the collapse of the main character really helped define and inform the noir aesthetic despite not being a film noir.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, though, because it is further perpetuating this debate of, like, what is a noir? What's not a noir? Do I know what it is? Is it cake? But at the same time, also, like, reiterating what are the key elements, though. Like, through this conversation, I'm like, okay, I feel like I do have a vibe. All the tropes I did have aren't necessarily bad, but there are reasons for them existing and why I associate them, and seeing that trail of just all these beautiful intellectuals from all over the globe. Like, this genre is pretty diverse, if I'm gonna say so myself. So how do we get this noir vibe into something that is not just, books and novels? We kind of talked that, screenplays and things like that, into film, into cinema. How do we get there?
Really what set the movement off wasn't just popular films like The Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane and Casablanca referencing the kind of stylistic beats. As the world was coming home from war, it was more ready for that sensibility. It was more ready to fold more cynical, more personal stories into the framework of cinema. It's a part of why the golden age of noir is regarded to be the late 40s throughout the 50s. It's why movements from Europe, like Italian neorealism, were able to start catching on with your more sort of astute film critics and your broader studies of film, because they had, in the neorealist movement, the same kind of personable, fallible touches as film noir. So you're putting this genre or this movement, however you want to define it, out into the world of film for an audience that is very receptive to the idea that their world was broken. And in particular with Third Man, that is indemnified by the setting, because almost as crucial as the development of noir to the Third Man is its setting in Allied occupied Austria.
I'm glad you brought it there, Jack, because it is important to talk about not just a time period, but also location when talking about this movie. And if you do get a chance to check it out, which I'm telling you, you can find it, not hard. Amazon Prime's got it there. You can pull it up, use your purchase, #not sponsored. But check it out, because the emphasis of the location is really ingrained in the plot. And I think it's really dope to talk about it because, one, a lot of the time we don't get works that focus on this time period. And the way you answered my question, Space, where you were saying how people really needed this. They needed to see or re-experience these kind of broken stories as a way of kind of, I don't know, escaping, but also expressing what people have gone through in this kind of post-war world. So you got to break it down for me, because I saw you do some hard body research on Austria. Now, I've been to Austria. I was too young. Yes, I have. I don't know if that's a flex or not, but I was able to go, and I had no idea any of this really happened there. Like, they really tried to move away from this vibe because I did not know the situation in Austria post-war and how unique it was, because it's kind of like in the middle of everything. Am I correct, Jack?
The story of Allied-occupied Austria begins in 1943 at the Moscow Conference, when Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill were discussing the plans for, an incursion into Europe and plans to take back the claims that Nazi Germany had made. Now, keep in mind, In 43, this was only a few months after the Battle of Kursk, which is the largest battle in human history. And the Russians were continually pushing the Germans back into Germany. And so there was an understanding that the Nazis were probably not going to prevail, especially if the British and American forces could find their way back onto the continent. And so they were beginning at this point to make post-war plans, and one of those was to declare the annexation of Austria by Germany null and void. They were not going to hold the Austrians responsible for the war the way that they were going to hold the Germans responsible for the war, but they made the agreement that any steps and any governance made under Nazi-occupied Austria was effectively null and void. And this is what basically led to the Vienna offensive by the Soviets as they continued to move west across the continent. They were convinced that they could get there before the Allies and install selected Austrian politicians in power. So communism was looking like it might be the order of the day, were it not for the intervention of one particular Austrian politician named Karl Renner, who BK is worthy of study in his own right. But what he did that was crucial was that he, through brokering agreements with the Soviets, convinced them to vest authority in his choices for who should govern Austria.
I want to know what kind of guy you got to be. Let me say that again. I want to know what kind of guy you got to be to put in these types of favors to become the holistic, overarching power, pretty much in charge and responsible for dictating what goes down in this country. Like, what backs did you scratch, Jack? Like, what kind of swag must you have to be able to come out here with that type of power? Because that's crazy.
Yeah, you got to be able to grease some palms or, spin some yarns in order to get that kind of ability. And like I said, Renner is an interesting guy to study beyond 1949 when Third Man was made, because he had a long and storied history within Austria of balancing democratic interests with communist interests and really trying to bridge the divide for the Austrian people. But before he could take power, Austria and Vienna had to be retaken. And Vienna was retaken between March 16th and April 15th, 1945, in a particularly brutal campaign by the Russian forces. And now, most of you who are any sort of history buff, you know about American atrocities and Russian atrocities as our forces closed in on Europe. Murders of innocent civilians, rapes of innocent civilians. And in Vienna, it was the Red Army and Russia that was taking center stage in these atrocities, which actually opened the door for a unique situation when the Western Allied troops entered Austria a week later. Over the initial period of governing over Austria, the Russians were so reviled for what they had done within the country's borders that forward combat troops were actually removed and replaced by occupational troops, which gave the West an opportunity, particularly the British, the French, and the Americans, to establish their own occupation zones without the Red Army really having the power or the influence to rebuke that. So Austria, by July 1945, when these occupational zones were agreed upon, was very, unique almost. Berlin and Germany were split between the Allies and the Russians as well, but it wasn't in a binary in Vienna. It was very much several consolidated interests who kept the center of Vienna as its own international zone. And this is where a lot of the post-war political chicanery between the East and the West really began to foment.
I'm glad that you laid it out that way, because I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit confused when the movie starts and is giving me this narration about, the state of Vienna. And I'm like, what does this got to do with this movie? Why am I here? Because it really does add that weight and that honest background commentary that's really important to kind of understand where all of our characters are going through in this story. So to bring it back to the state of Vienna, right? It's sectioned off. You know what I'm saying? It's quadrants. Y'all got your homies over here, the Russians, here with the Germans, and then some weird DMZ zone over here, trying to be Korea, but not. It's worse than that. So anything you might have imagined, at least I think, is not what is actually going down there. Like, I would not want to be in that type of situation where they're asking you for your papers, like, to go anywhere. Oh, I can't go into this bar because it's on the Russian side. Like, what? I'm sorry, Jack. Could you live in a life or a society that operated that way?
I'll tell you what, I would not have wanted to live in post-war Austria between the years of 45 and 50 for any reason, really, because it was a very bleak time for the country. In the East, in the Russian claims, the Russians began to basically take over and run hundreds of Austrian businesses, and they created their own conglomerate, the USIA, which essentially refused to contribute to the Austrian economy. They did not want to pay taxes and they did not want to pay tariffs, and in turn, the Western concerns in the country refused to give them legitimacy or licensing as a result. And because you had this conglomerate in Russia that was only really giving resources to the East, and you had these competing Allied concerns, there were real practical problems that far extend just where you could go. There was a significant problem with food availability, especially in Vienna. The city was near starvation, BK, for 2 years from 1945 and 1947. In fact, when the Marshall Plan came into effect, something like 15 to 16% of all Marshall Plan spending in Austria was just spent on providing food and aid for people. And the Marshall Plan, moreover, didn't really do a lot to help the agricultural industry or the consumer goods industry in Austria. So they were wholly dependent on this pipeline, while industries like metallurgy and oil were beginning to have a post-war explosion and actually thrive within the country. And all of these economic concerns really ramped up the tensions within the country that you see within the Third Man. But not only that, the lack of available goods and the rise in real wages due to the Marshall Plan meant that Austrians who wanted to spend money on stuff and wanted to further their ability to live as they chose were engaged with a thriving black market that had surged in the late 40s to fill that void that these competing governments just couldn't provide to the Austrian people. So Austria, and Vienna in particular, were really a hotbed for racketeering and for crime.
That's hilarious. I'm laughing at demise. I know that's terrible, but, it's so funny. Like, anytime I hear, near starvation, resources thin, I'm like, yep, there's gotta be a black market. Somebody's selling it somewhere.
It is a truism of history, BK.
Right? I'm like, look, a thriving black market really does spark the great premise for some serious dope stories. So I'm actually kind of hyped that they, chose this setting, because it's so, realistic, if you know what I mean. Like, there's no really fantasy. It's not truly made up. It's grounded in realism, and then kind of explores this reality that was real to many people back in the day. So the Third Man, if we're going to go on premise alone, I'm not going to lie, when I found out the situation in Austria, when it was like that, all these competing forces and everyone's out here trying to just get by, I was like, all right, this story is going to be a bit more interesting than just a love story or something like that.
Well, it was certainly a story that interested Graham Greene very strongly. He had gone to Vienna because he was interested in writing a novella about the city at the time. Graham Greene, most of you probably know from his work The Quiet American, which was about an American journalist in 1950s Vietnam, as the French claim to the colony at the time was rapidly eroding and American influence was increasing. But before that, Greene was trying to really learn about the interesting stories of Vienna, and he was given the full sort of spectrum of what the city was about. He was given tours of the Vienna sewers by his friend and actress Elizabeth Montague. He was introduced to Times correspondent Peter Smolka, who regaled him with stories about the Vienna black markets. And really, it helped him develop the framework of the story that we see on screen. But there were key differences in his novella, BK. Calloway was the narrator. It wasn't just Carol Reed adding context at the beginning. Lyman Martins were English, not American. And most crucially, and something we'll get into, at the end of the novella, Anna and Martins stay together. And we'll tell you what happens in the film, but, these are pretty critical changes from their initial writing.
Yeah, you know I love to see that transition. I'm always like, all right, how does it get from the source material to on screen? I want to know. I want to be in the writer's room. I want to see it. So, one, I can clearly tell someone did a case study on this and went there because it just feels so authentic. I guess I'm not someone from Vienna. I shouldn't really be giving it that pass, but at least as me as an outsider, I felt like I was there. I didn't feel like there was a, made up place. I had to ask at the Jack, I was like, is this real? Like right off top when they're saying, the intro and the narration, I'm like, is this a fantasy world he's telling me or is this fact? And Jack's like, yeah, it's fact. So once that hit me, I was like, okay, this has to be at least grounded in some actual experience. So to find out that one, it was a novella, that's hilarious. I kind of want to read it now if we can find it. But two, to see that transition and the changes that were made, very interesting. And I think the movie does some really good creative liberties, if I do say so myself, Jack.
It does, and it happened because of a lot of positive collaboration on this. Really where the film gained its momentum is Hollywood, major producer from Hollywood, David O. Selznick, who you would know from producing works like Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca or Gone with the Wind.
Oh, okay.
He became very interested in the idea for the film, and his main contribution, as he claimed, was to provide Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten as principal actors to attach to this. So that really gave it the momentum to get done. The only real problem they had in terms of shooting was there was a very, very strong argument over the ending, as I mentioned. Greene wanted to give the film a happy ending, but Carol Reed, the director, and David O. Selznick, they kind of outright refused to add an artificial happy ending to the film. And I kind of see their point with it, is that the way that the third man unravels, you don't want things tied up in a nice little bow. You want these humans to continue existing along the analogs that they do, including evincing all of their flaws.
I'm really glad that you draw attention to that because I would have been so upset. I wouldn't have liked the movie. I'm just gonna put it out there in the world. It's boom, it's there. If this had a happy ending with some bows on the end, one, it just doesn't fit the tone of the film. And again, if those of you who've seen it or are going to watch it, you'll get it. But the tone doesn't even sound like there is an inch of hope. And I feel like that's kind of the reason. Like, I feel like that's intentional, Jack. Like, we are not going to sugarcoat or put on this Hollywood, film happy ending to please people, especially when you're trying to tell a story grounded in such very, broken and deep characters. So, your girl would have been on to the next if this had a happy ending. So, shout outs to Reed, Selznick. All right, holding it down for us viewers. I see you. So, what's next? Where do we go from here, right? Like...
I mean, really, the best place to go to this in terms of just putting the creative forces together, because I'd like to start getting into this, and we can kind of bridge to that because of what happened in terms of the score for this film. Now, BK, you already mentioned that you're in love with the scoring for this film, but it almost came together by accident. Carol Reed, according to his assistant director, Guy Hamilton, was looking for a sound that was uniquely Austrian, but he thought it would be far too overwrought for his film to be comprised of, classical waltzes and Mozart references and things of that nature. And so he happened to be at a club one night, and by complete accident, heard composer Anton Karas playing the zither, which is the string instrument that emboldens and defines the composition and is, used right from the outset. Our opening for The Third Man isn't just a title card over black. It's Anton Karas playing the theme on the zither. It gives you those lines and those solid contrasts up top with this very interesting... How would you describe the sound, BK? Because it's something that you responded to very strongly.
Oh, I freaked out. So one, for those of you who are SpongeBob fans, just think about the outro of SpongeBob, and it sounds like that, but better, okay? It is clearly where they drew inspiration from. It has this, I don't have the word. It's not tropical. There's no word to describe the feeling. The liveliness, nigiyaka in Japanese, like
Liveliness is a really good way of putting it, I think.
it has like this very awesome feeling, not just a typical stringed instrument, because you're doing a lot of that finger picking motion as a guitarist. You know, it has that kind of traditional, maybe a little bit of that Spanish feel where you fast strum in that nature. So it operates similarly, but has a very distinct tone, and it's super dope. And the way they start the film off, Jack, I love that they do it this way, because I think it fits my motif of being like, they wanted this to be real life. They wanted this to be grounded in realism. And so having that live playing, you're like, no, that's the instrument. You're looking at the instrument. I was like, oh my God, Jack, this is it. I'm here now. I need to know, where does this instrument come from? What does this music mean? Because it invokes such strong feeling, and not just at the beginning, but throughout the entire film. Like, the music really does carry you in some of the most intense scenes.
Absolutely, and as we start getting into it here, as Holly Martins, the principal character, played by Joseph Cotten, is arriving in Vienna pretty much in a whirlwind. You know, he's coming to visit his friend Harry Lime, who has a job for him, but when he shows up at the apartment, he finds out that Lime is dead. You know, he goes to Harry Lime's funeral, which is the first point at which he sees Anna Schmidt, the female protagonist for the film. This music undergirding it really does set the film in its identity. You're being carried through these very kind of suspicious, almost comical, but not played up for laughs, more sort of like funny coincidences. As you're being carried through these moments by the score, you're pretty much thrown into the world of Vienna, Austria from the outset. You're given a little narration to explain the place you're being set, but really in the opening here, it is the mannerisms of the characters and it is the music that sets the tone.
I think it's super cool because you go from this really dope music to, honestly, I feel like we talked about a lot, the narration and the setup of the location, and really, honestly, I think establishing who our characters are going to be. Like, the way it doesn't start out with just our main protagonist. They kind of let him come into the picture. I feel like that was really what got me. Because normally when I watch, like, old classic films, like, it's too cliche, you know, and it's very much like, you know who the characters are. You know right off the bat, this guy's important, that guy's bad, this guy's good. And at the start, you're presented with those themes, but they get completely, like, subverted as the story goes on.
Oh, no question. And furthermore, I think one of the great things about the opening salvos of this film are that you really are clued in from the outset that Martins is not going to be your ironclad Hollywood hero. You know, after he attends the funeral, he needs to catch a ride from Calloway, who turns out to be a police officer for this international zone who is investigating Harry Lime for racketeering. And when Martins takes offense to this and tries to strike Calloway, his fellow officer punches him instead, and Martins basically gets his ass whooped. You know, he's not going to be able to get his way in this town. And you see that too when he starts meeting Harry's friends and when he tracks down Anna Schmidt. You know, people are not going to accede to him and his presence just because he's the big shot American and just because he's the focus of the film. No, he's going to be treated with a fair amount of disdain. People aren't going to want to talk to him, or if they do want to talk to him, they're going to want to try and throw him for a loop and con him.
Yeah, I think this movie does really cool things with its characters, specifically Holly Martins, you're mentioning. That's our main character here. Yeah, as he does get to, you know, meet the friends and kind of get settled in his world, it does feel like he is this hot shot, or at least certain people view him that way. And you get to kind of see a lot of different lenses as to how other people view him. And then the final lens of how I think the writers want the audience to view him. So I feel like that's so cool, is because not everyone has the same impression about every character throughout this film. And I think that's something that this movie does so well, is showing, like, I have this opinion for this character because of these reasons, and so on and so forth. So in Holly's case, you know, I thought it was so funny that he happens to be a novelist, a Pulp Fiction novelist, which we had talked about. But that's not too poppin', if you get me wrong. Like, that's not a novelist as a whole, or at least not what I think he wanted to be when he signed up for this sermon, or what would you call that, Jack? The little speech he agrees to do in order to be able to stay where he is longer to feel out this investigation.
Yeah, in one of the more comical subplots in the movie, there is this very high-minded British intellectual who offers to allow Martins to stay basically on his dime in a hotel because, according to one of the officers who is enamored by his pulp novels, he is talked up as this great novelist. And so this guy, this British man, says, oh, well, of course, we want to have you talk with our society and, give us a talk on, like, romantic realism and all of these different concepts. And he's just sort of, being clued into how much of a Philistine he really is. And it's in fitting with his circumstances. Calloway, when he meets him, considers him really to be a nuisance. He wants Martins to get back on a plane immediately and go back to America because he's going to just get in the way of this racketeering case against Harry Lime. When he meets the character Kurtz, who is regarded as one of Harry Lime's closest friends there, Kurtz, sort of leads him around. He spins a yarn about how Harry got hit by a car and he was still alive a little bit and he's responsive. But you can tell he is, really in a slimy way trying to give Martins a story that he wants to hear. The porter, who purportedly saw what happened to Harry Lime, he has a conflicting story, but he is very reluctant to actually talk to Martins. And you get this air that people don't really want him around. And I think it's really cool that you talk about the way he is regarded, because it seems the only person that doesn't really mind his presence and is actively interested in being engaged with him is Anna Schmidt, who Kurtz and the other racketeers desperately don't want Martins to connect with.
Yeah, Anna, yes. We just have to put that on the world there, Jack, for just take a moment.
Shout out to Alita Valley. Shout out because not only is she a phenomenal actress, not only is she very beautiful in that classic Hollywood sense, she also had to restart her career because she refused to work for Italian fascists. So you go get it, girl.
Hell yes, we love that, standing in what you believe in, even when it comes to the workplace. That's a hard thing to do. So, 110%. But you are right, though. Anna seems to be the only one that at least wants to entertain Holly in this manner. One, because, of course, it's personal, right? We're finding out that Anna is a lover to Lime, and she's kind of invested in this situation, but mostly emotionally invested. Nothing to really truly sinister coming from her. Firstly, you kind of think that Anna's like really her, I don't know, the one innocent, at least at the start. She is pretty sweet and seems like, she's really just in it for love. And I really enjoy the sidebar. I feel like it's most noticeable in the scenes with Anna. The notion of like the language barrier, because we mentioned, right, the premise of how there's so many like different nations really fighting over for territory and how that's big and how it's, Germans v Russians. And then we have our American main character, Holly. There aren't no subtitles for us to know what other people are speaking. Like, the viewer also has to go in blind as the American, not knowing certain German conversations, having characters like the porter try to be able to convey his story in broken English, and having Anna there to be able to kind of help translate really does help you get a better scope of what's going on. So that relationship becomes more than just practical, though, as Anna and Holly kind of get together and learn the truth about both of their relationships with Lime.
I think it's really cool that you mention here the language barrier, because I interpret it in watching The Third Man through that kind of cynical noir lens. The thing with post-war Austria is that you had these four zones controlled by the Russians, the Americans, the British, and the French. But Austria is a majority German-speaking country. And so it's a very interesting thing to see all of these different factions moving around each other. You hear the Russian soldiers talk in English. You hear everybody conducting themselves in language that you can understand. But the Germans are all speaking in German. They aren't given that sort of, yeah, he's German, but he actually speaks English in the film kind of affectation you get from a lot of classic Hollywood, they're allowed to be deliberately not understood in the film. And it speaks to the way that all these competing concerns were walking over the average person, and how that really built up a resentment among the Austrian people. And you see it in little scenes like when Calloway comes to Anna's home and is raiding it to find her false passport and her false papers that Harry had forged for her. The most noise made in the scene, while everybody goes about their business, the most noise is made by her German landlady, who is ceaseless in complaining over and over again about what is being done in this house she owns. And instead of being responded to, she's being abjectly ignored because this international police force has bigger fish to fry in finding this forgery and finding this passport and putting Anna into hot water. So the machinations and the games being played are meant to supersede the actual daily lives of the people who live in Vienna. And I think it's a really fantastic touch to the execution of the film.
Absolutely. I think for me, noticing that theme is early on, when you have the residents of the apartment that what's his name, Lime, is supposed to have been living in, who seem to have definitely witnessed something or on look generally, because everyone knows everyone in this town. So I feel like it is very interesting when they sent that point home. I think early on when I noticed the lady looking out the window and seeing how, involved the neighbors and the community is, which I took as the native Viennans, versus how the police or the international task force operate. It is very interesting that you point that out, and I'm glad that you made note of it, because it is true. All the residents, all the people living there, they're almost inconsequential, right? They're almost like forgotten, like you mentioned. And it really does start to hit home when you do get to Anna's home and you're seeing how they're treating a woman's home, just going through all her stuff for what? Like, if you knew it was papers, because they obviously seem to know it was a paper situation, why are we going through her whole clothes? What are we looking for? And I think that is what planted the seed, at least for me, that there might have been a greater reason as to why Calloway was so invested, or at least the racketeering was something a little bit more important than I thought at the beginning. I thought it was something like cigarettes, because of the way everyone was trading cigarettes. I was like, is there a cigarette thing going on here? The way they went through Anna's home, bro, they raided that piece, bro. It was like looking for some drugs. That's what I thought. I was like, oh, there's got to be drugs. There's something going on here, Jack.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a frequent occurrence throughout The Third Man, is these other commodities are referenced as, very finite goods. When Calloway is having his first meeting with Martins thinks that the idea of the racketeering is centered around oil or tires, manufacturers that are hard to get a hold of. But Vienna, throughout all this, it's painted as a place where everything is scarce, including information, but Martins continues to persist until he meets another one of Lime's friends, the Romanian, Popescu, which sort of sets off this cat-and-mouse game between Holly and the racketeers. Because right after this meeting, BK, Popescu and Kurtz basically convene with the doctor, who is supposed to be Lime's doctor, who's also very cagey with Holly. They all get together and they clearly are planning ways to stymie his investigation. And they do so not only by killing the porter that you referenced who lives in Lime's building, because he might actually try to testify and give Martins a better picture of what really happened, but it turns the citizenry against Martins and against Anna Schmidt, because when they show up after the porter's been murdered, a child recognizes Martins from an argument that he had had with the porter. And he, through yelling at him, managed to sort of make everybody in this giant crowd suspicious of Martins. And it is just a further indemnification of this idea that these foreigners who are, competing over various concerns within Austria are just the most unwelcome crowd of people you could possibly come across.
Yeah, I also thought that moment you mentioned, right, where they are pulling up to check in with the porter, right? Typical detective scenario where you got your informant who's like, I'm going to give you information at this time at night. Meet me here. And of course, you go to meet them there and they get got before they can give you the information. So this same scenario pans out for Holly, right? And he's pulling up with Anna to the scene trying to get the info, and there's a whole mob of, I call them civs, right? Looks like neighbors or people who are nosy, right, around there who incite this kind of violent moment. And I was like, this is such a very interesting world building moment too. I definitely got the thing that it like takes a village in this moment. I was like, okay, either this like racketeering thing goes deep, or like, you know, these citizens are very connected, and the idea of community and you know, keeping your nose down for the greater good is like a thing that's ingrained, and Holly's really overstepping his boundaries here. For me, it's the first time where I feel like kind of Holly is in the wrong, not necessarily for being framed as to being a killer, but more for putting his nose in too deep. Like here you're like, Holly, there's no going back now. Not just because you're accused, but you're in here. Like the neighbors are involved. You're known. Where are you going to go? Back to America? At this point, Anna needs your help now.
And that's really the only place that you're given as the film progresses to really root for Holly Martins, is his relationship and the budding trust that he has with Anna Schmidt, because they really don't have anybody else to go to. Everybody else really just doesn't want them around. And so you have these two people who are connected by this sort of devotion to a friend, somebody that they're willing to sort of, you know, pawn off responsibility when it comes to the negative things he may or may not have done. And that devotion, really, you can see it as loyalty, but you can also see it as delusion and denial. And as another aspect that really takes Martins down into being a deeply fallible character. It's around this time you start seeing his paranoia get a little bit the better of him. It's here where you see him do his book talk and come across really as a babbling, drunken Philistine to a very high-minded audience that is expecting more of him. And immediately he has to go on the run again because Popescu and his goons are trying to chase him around. And he gets bitten by a parrot when he's running from them. You know, he is not infallible. He is proving himself to be not just caught up in this, but to be as human as the very racketeers he's going after. And it is in this kind of whirlwind where Calloway literally has to pull him into his office and reveal the sum total of what Harry Lime's scam actually has been.
And that reveal with Calloway, I really think that's very interesting because I say this preemptively because you guys are still wondering, what is the reveal? It's this whole penicillin thing. And I was like, I knew it's drugs. I knew it was some type of drug, Jack. I called it. I said it.
Basically, Harry Lime had been intercepting shipments of penicillin, which was, of course, extremely rare, like many commodities in Austria, and he was diluting it. And the dilution was killing a lot of people, men, women, and children, but it was also forcing some people to basically be institutionalized in hospitals forever in extreme agony. So it's this moment where, through very systemic laying out of evidence, Calloway takes away all illusions that Holly has that Lime is a good guy. But yet, when he goes back to see Anna, there's a real conflict there because Anna is still very much in love with him, even though she knows about the penicillin.
Right, and you mean in love with Lime, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I feel like it's a good point to talk about this here, right? We didn't mention it. I'm calling her Anna because, is it Anna? It's Anna in my head.
It's Anna, yes, it's
okay,
Anna.
Cool. I was like, you know, a little Overwatch gets you saying the wrong names very easily.
We're not in the American South, BK. It's not Anna, it's Anna.
Thank you, right? No, but it's important to mention here, I think, is that Anna throughout the film up until this point continually mistakes Holly for Lime in a lot of different times, calling him Harry, having moments I would see as kind of little moments of weakness where she lets Holly in a bit, but then retracts from letting him in when it comes to a moment where she recalls Harry, recalls Lime, and falls back into being in love with him. Although there seems to be this deep connection between Anna and Holly throughout the film, when Holly goes back here, I feel like the emotions are so weird. Like almost like hard boy friend zone, as we like to say. Like, look, I'm taken still. I don't care if he's alive or dead or a bad man. Whatever it is, he's my person. And Holly's kind of like, hey, look, we can just like explore something new. That's the vibe I got from Holly, which was so weird to me.
Well, it was interesting to see because Holly is trying to move her towards this attitude of, like, hey, why not give me a shot? But Anna, in her real deep depression, is despondent towards the idea of ever trying to love again. She is very frank about wanting to die rather than have to try and fall in love with somebody again. And eventually Holly kind of realizes it. He remarks that, he could make her laugh, do all these sorts of things that are affectionate to her, and it wouldn't even make a mark. She is, like everybody in Vienna, trapped in this sort of desperate world. And it's very interesting, BK, because she's making all these allusions to Harry. She's confusing Holly Martins for him. She's mentioning how her cat only ever liked Harry. It is in this moment where the cat, which had appeared in her apartment a couple times, peeks out and starts being a little bit affectionate to somebody who's hiding in the shadows. And that's where you're clued in on one of the first big twists of this film. Harry Lime is still alive, BK, and it is Orson Welles in all of his glory.
Dun, dun, dun. I was not ready for that type of reveal. It was such a swaggy reveal. And the cat, Jack, I was so hyped. I saw the cat. I was like, why is this cat here? This cat is interesting. This cat's going to be something. So the fact that they used that to give that type of a bomb, I was like, wow, this is some pretty good writing, Jack, if I do say so myself.
It's almost like Graham Greene has done this before.
Right? But the reveal is super dope. That weight of like the twist is one thing, but also it paves the way to figure out how are our characters going to respond to the situation. Because for the whole film up until now, I think as the viewer, you're like, okay, how is everybody going to react when we find out that he really was murdered and we find out who the killer is? And now the conversation is, well, why would he fake his death? And what does that mean and who's involved, right? New questions start to form. And how are our characters going to respond to this? How is Anna going to respond to this? Is she going to find out? My mind is going crazy. Like, I honestly don't know if that scene went any faster, if I would have had time to process anything. Because it's it's a short scene to say, but it definitely has some really good beats with the light shining in on the face and the reveal of the actor in Lime and all his glory, and you're sitting there with every new question you have just to digest, and they really let you ruminate in that moment. So I think that's honestly one of my favorite parts of the whole film. I'm not gonna lie, Jack.
I love that scene as well. It's a really interesting moment because Martins does spot him and is literally yelling at this guy as if he's just another guy who works for the racketeers who's following him. And he's like, yelling at him, I'm getting ready to leave. You can come out. What kind of spy do you think you are? And he's very shocked to see his friend Harry's face, and even more shocked to see him, bolt into the shadows again. But I think one of the elegant things about the way that the mystery unfolds is that you're given the piece of Martins convincing the others around him that Harry is alive. He drags Calloway and one of his officers out onto the street where he lost Lime, and they're very skeptical. They're very doubting of him right until the moment they discover the entrance to the sewers and realize that Lime's scheme has been that he moves around the sewers for mobility, and he's been hiding in the Russian sector. And then they go to the grave Lime is supposedly buried in, and they find the body of a co-conspirator. So there's all of these questions, as you mentioned, that begin to crop up, and you're wondering very strongly what the convenience is. And it is at this point where Holly kind of gets fed up with the cat and mouse game. He literally goes to Kurtz and the doctor when they're hanging out, and he yells at them from the street demanding that Harry meet him. And it is at this point they get to a fairground where Holly and Harry do meet and give us one of the most famous scenes in this film. This powerhouse of a conversation on a Ferris wheel between Holly Martins and Harry Lime.
Oh, you told me, Jack, you were like, this is my scene. This is the monologue of the century. And I see why you say that, because honestly, everything's been building up to this moment. And it's a moment you didn't even think you were going to get at the start of the film. So I'm not going to lie. When this moment hit, I was kind of shook. I was like kind of just like sitting back in my chair, like I didn't know what to expect. Like my body was ready because like, what's Lime going to say? You know, I'm having all these questions. I'm like, y'all better answer them because I'm ready. I'm ready to hear. Now, Jack, what was the line that you quoted, though? Like, because that was what got me, too.
Well, the line is important, but I think before we get to that, because it is kind of his ending point when he's speaking, the first thing you notice about Harry is he's very jovial, he's very chummy with Holly, as though their friendship hasn't really lapsed whatsoever. But as they get on the Ferris wheel, you know, he opens the door, and you can clearly see there's a present threat that he is going to eliminate Holly for going to the police and for telling Anna that he's still alive, and all of these things that put spanners in the works for Harry. But then, you know, once he finds out that Holly is protected by these international police, you know, his mood changes completely. He shuts the door back, you know, he's talking to him like a friend. But you're also given a clue as to why Harry Lime is such a villain within the script, and why Roger Ebert would one day go on to call him his favorite villain on screen. There is this true air of cynicism about him. He is somebody who views the world in such a realistic way that his only goal is to exploit the world around him. And it is just this deeply evil sort of way of disregarding everybody around him. He talks about not really particularly caring about Anna and her situation. He talks about not really minding that he's killing people with his scam. You know, he points out of the Ferris wheel and he says, you know, look at each of those dots down there. How would you feel if you were making $20,000 even if one of those dots stops? Imagine you're making that money every time a dot stops. And he's trying in a very cynical way to bring Holly Martins over to the dark side as his friend. He wants him to be on his side in this. And that is really a very insidious kind of worldview. But he caps it off with this line that really lets you know what his mindset is. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borghese, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. And BK, that's a heck of a cynical line.
It is. It's so... It's jaw-dropping in a sense, but that doesn't get the point across. Where it's almost like you're so twisted, like, in your worldview of, like, art and freedom and passion versus, like, you know, that strict mentality of, like, I know, cuckoo clock. Oh, well, that's not a big thing. But also invention, to say that something didn't come from it is kind of crazy, and peace is very strong. My God. At that moment, I knew Lime was not the guy I thought he was for over an hour of the movie. That is what I have to say. Like, that line there was like, man, the cynicism, man. He thinks it's better and honestly more advantageous to continue to live in a world that is corrupted and plagued by such ailments. Like, what kind of dude has gone so far to just not only accept that as his reality, but to also try to coerce other people to see that viewpoint as well, to bring people over to the dark side, like you said, Jack. I was like, holy man, I don't know if I like this Lime dude. I thought I was liking him for a bit, but now not so much.
And the thing is that, you know, now with the progression of time, we've seen this trope very many times. We've seen a lot of villains in popular culture to this day who very much believe in fomenting chaos over order. The one that comes to mind immediately as an anime fan is the homunculus from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. So the vibe we're all familiar with. But when this came out, this was a rarity. You didn't see villains this cynical. Villains were almost drawn in a more cartoonish way. In the war period, Nazis were not, nuanced, broken people. They were just comically cartoony, evil people in conjunction with the propaganda that was necessary at the time. You didn't have villains that you could identify psychologically what you felt was wrong with them. You didn't have villains that challenged your perception like this. And it's one of the reasons that Orson Welles' work in the film comes across so strongly, because not only is Harry Lime broken, but he's so broken that he's willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone in his life to get what he needs. And so this is the guy that Holly and Calloway have to plan around. And Holly has his reservations, but BK, here's where his character really does start to turn, because I know this was a very disappointing moment for you. In getting his friend, in taking his friend out, Holly gives Calloway his price. And at the end of the day, you realize that the only thing he's trying to salvage from Austria, from Vienna, is his pound of flesh. And that pound of flesh is getting Anna out of Austria and getting her paper problems all put behind her.
Yeah, I just didn't like him. And, I feel like in this moment where, let's pan out the situation, because I'm saying a lot of knows. The guy wants to be able to get the affairs in order to be able to get the girl away to safety, right? As if he knows what the girl wants, and getting away is a choice that she wants. And I got really upset because you see Holly being like, all right, like, I don't care what it is. I'll do what I got to do as long as my girls are right. And I'm like, bro, this ain't your girl. Did she ask you for this help? No. And I think Anna has the same sentiment as me as we see her reaction to all the plans that Holly did make, and how Anna's just not happy with it either. I was like, girl, after my own heart. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not the only one who felt some type of way when Holly tried to do this.
Oh, it's an incredible scene, because this is where you start seeing the bond between Anna and Holly really break. And moreover, it starts tapping into something very important about Anna's character. She is not the typical female Hollywood protagonist who is totally dependent upon the male lead to exist within the world. Nor is she your typical film noir femme fatale, this extremely sultry, erotic, but ultimately duplicitous woman. No, she is just a character within the story who is looking to, like everybody else, take some semblance of control about the life she lives and to have some agency. And so she is, in rebelling against Holly here, really rebelling for her freedom. And there is this slim chance that they're going to be able to stay together and that they're not going to participate in Calloway's plot to get Lime. But Calloway, as ever with noir, pulls out just about the most cynical ploy you could possibly get to guilt Holly into helping him. He, just as he's leading him, quote unquote, to the airport, he takes a detour that takes Holly to the hospital where these victims of the penicillin scam are being held. And it is just this really visceral build up to the most cynical aspects of the film. Is Calloway is not showing Holly these people because he wants him to feel sorry. He's showing him these victims because he wants to get him back in line and back as a part of this plan.
Yeah, visceral is definitely the word I would use. I think it is very jarring, the scene in the hospital with the penicillin victims, I guess is what we want to call them, but the victims you never see their faces of, which I understand practical effects might have been a little bit crazy to really do, but I think it's also intentional. I think it also sets a tone for Calloway a bit, as in he's willing to kind of utilize any means necessary to solve this case, even to the point where I'm going to dangle poor child. They're in cribs. Am I wrong? At least it felt like they were in cribs. It looked like they were babies to me.
Well, it's an interesting visual aesthetic that they work on here, because when you're seeing Martins here, you're seeing him behind the bars that are on the foot of each of these beds. And it fits in with a motif visually that has existed. There are a lot of very straight lines, a lot of grates, a lot of bars throughout the film. And it's something visually that builds upon that idea that everybody in this city is trapped. And I think that that is really an important visual motif in Holly going along with Calloway's plan and agreeing to be his plant at this cafe where they're going to try and nail Harry Lime. Is there's a visual cue that, oh yeah, this guy's been here long enough that he's trapped too. And he has one last chance to get out, BK, because of the fact that Anna shows up at this cafe before Harry does.
Yeah, I thought that moment was very interesting too. And you might need to break it down for me, because I think I was lost in the sauce, because it's tension at its peak at this point, right? You've got the plant, it's a stakeout, we're waiting, the cafe's here, guy's supposed to show up, and Anna pulls through, like, what's good? And I was, like, confused, I'm not gonna lie. She showed up unexpectedly to me. I didn't think she was gonna be there, Jack.
Well, she recognized what was going to happen to Harry, and she was there really kind of as a last ditch to talk Holly out of this plan. But every chance that they have to make good, to get out together and to be on the same page, is eradicated, because when Lime walks in, she is yelling at Martin about being a police informant. And then when she turns around and sees that Lime has come in the back door, she immediately starts yelling about what the plan is to Lime. And she really does make a statement of where if she's going to have any loyalties, it's going to be to the person that she loves, who ironically couldn't give a shit about her, BK. And so, because he's gotten this tip off, and because Harry Lime's all about self-preservation, nothing else, he books it, and he books it back into the sewers for what is probably the most famous scene visually from The Third Man, is this very confusing, very tense sewer chase that has been referenced in everything from Scooby-Doo to Seven to The Fugitive, to name your work of fiction that has involved a cat and mouse chase. It all dates back here to The Third Man's climax.
Oh yeah, this scene is really cool. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie though, it felt like the longest chase scene in history, but it was still believable, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of the times when you have those chase scenes, it drags out and it's unrealistic. You're like, yo, this guy would have gotten got by now. Or like, why are these guys so stupid? Now, the sewer scene here, I honestly think is probably one of the most believable chase scenes I've seen in a very long time. And I say that because, like, they really take time to kind of show the events unfolding rather than just montaging things. I think we get that a lot in more recent film and cinematography, but in The Third Man, they take a really long time and a lot of attention to really setting up the stages of this chase and setting up the pathways and the reactions of Lime as he's finding out that his ends are cut off, finding out that his typical routes are being met with opposition, and seeing Lime have to finesse those situations, roll with the punches, and find an escape with seemingly no out. I thought the scene had great tension space.
And that's the thing, like, that's what gets me about this chase, is that when you watch most prototypical chase scenes, it feels very much point A to point B. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that in certain films. There are chase sequences that I love that pan out that way. But this one works because it's Harry and his pursuers all trapped in a labyrinth that is gradually closing in on him. He is finally in this climax being trapped. And so it is no surprise that after he takes a bullet to the back and is trying to crawl out of the sewers, he is stopped and ultimately kind of begs for his fate for Martins to shoot him and kill him at this stairwell that is basically sealed off with a grate that he tries to reach through, in this very visual image of his fingers coming up from underground. And it's just this ultimate moment of both men who have loved each other recognizing that in their own way they're both trapped. And the consequence for Harry is going to be that he loses his life. But the consequence for Holly is that he is going to live in, whether it be with shame or with regret, but he is going to have to live with these moments. He's going to have to live with the fact that he shot his best friend. And it all sets us up to go back to the cemetery where Lime is finally buried. And for the final shot of the film, which, BK, I knew, because I saw this film about a decade ago for the first time, I knew what the ending shot was and how significant it was, but I didn't tell you anything about it because I wanted you to be enamored by it and I wanted you to go off on it. So I'm going to leave the floor to you. Tell people what happens in this final shot after the burial of Harry Lime, and tell them why you think it's important.
Oh man, Jack, that final scene, I'm glad you're giving me the floor because, whew, one, I'm glad you didn't tell me what was going to go down because that would have been a big spoiler. Because this ending is super impactful. I don't know if it's just me as a woman. Maybe it is. Because normally at the end of these types of detective love drama situations, right? The guy gets with the girl. That's the whole thing. That's the premise. That's what happens. There is no other situation. Well, in the third, man, I'm going to tell you, bruh, that shit don't happen. Hell nah. You think Anna's gonna go to Holly for what? For what? She was saying the wrong name since day one. Let's be honest. We all knew she wasn't coming for Holly at the end of there. And I really think that the decision to really go through with shooting Lime at the end because of their trapped fates really solidified Anna's opinion towards Holly and kind of really showed how different worlds I feel like they lived in. And there was no world where there was a happy ending. And Anna just walks right on by. That's all I got to say. She walks right on by. She put the heels on, the pumps, coming from the funeral. Say, you want to stop and holler at me? Boy, you ain't catcalling me, baby. I'm walking on to the next. I don't even know your name. I'm not going to acknowledge your existence. I am my own woman. I don't need no man. Hell yes.
And what's so visceral about it is that it's all set up in the prototypical way that a Hollywood film would end to get the guy and the girl together. He is about to drive off with Calloway and just leave her behind as she's walking home from the cemetery. But he, asks Calloway to stop, and he gets out, and he's just waiting there for her as she walks down the road. And it's all in this one uninterrupted, beautiful shot of this lane that she's walking down. So you have this buildup of tension of like, she's coming towards him. She's going to stop and she's going to, have a moment with him. You think you're at least going to get a moment with these two. They've solved this mystery. They've shared as people. They've trusted and lost trust. And she just doesn't treat it like it's anything. And it's beautiful because it's this moment where you realize she refuses to be controlled. Anna finally has her own agency as a human being. It took a horrifying situation and the breaking of her heart, but in 1949, a female character was allowed to end a major film under her own agency without having to end up with the principal male protagonist. It is groundbreaking as a idea. It is groundbreaking as an ending to a film. Nothing like it had ever been made before.
I'm astounded because honestly, to this day and age, I really don't think we see stuff like this, period. You know what I mean? Like, this is not things we get to see very often. Just to see something like this in a classic work really gave me hope, I'm not gonna lie. In a strange way, Jack, like hope that people can see that a woman enacting her agency or ending a film in which the woman doesn't get with the man can leave a lasting impact, can be something very momentous and super interesting in the sense of the plot. I'm not going to lie, I've thought about it for a bit, Jack. I was like, would I have liked the film if they got together? And I really don't think so. I don't know about you, but I feel like Anna refusing to be controlled, refusing to have her life be dictated for her, and kind of choosing this what would be seemingly a more, I don't know, negative path of life, a more difficult, a more struggling path, not choosing to be whisked away and saved by a man and sent off to another country, right? She's choosing to walk that hard line, and she's making her choice, and I think it's so strong and so empowering, and honestly makes me like Anna as a character even more.
I know, she's fantastic throughout the film, but that choice, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Graham Greene was wrong, and Carol Reed and David O. Selznick were right. This was the ending this film needed. And though it was regarded, initially mixed upon its Austrian release, in particular, the camera angles being canted were of note. William Wyler, the famous director, actually sent Carol Reed in the mail a spirit level and told him, just put this on top of the camera next time you shoot a film. But after that initial criticism faded, and the film got its American and British releases, it became overwhelmingly regarded as positive. There are people to this day that will still contend that The Third Man is a perfect film. I don't know if I go that far, but it has such clout and such respect as a work of film that it is one of the few that is set out there as a perfect film.
Wow, that's a big, lofty claim. I won't say that it's not a perfect film. I just wonder what it is that adds the cherry on top for people, and I guess maybe it being the first of its kind is that cherry, and I have to kind of acknowledge that. And I'm also glad, Jack, that you mentioned the canted camera angles. You mean that as in like them being like tilted, right? Like off kilter?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because I pointed that out and I was like, wow, these are the similar type of angles that we saw when we were watching 12 Monkeys last week for the pod, but used in a different way. So I found that so fascinating to see that, like, this film, The Third Man, is really what kind of honestly showed light to those off angles and how they can be used to really add tension or add in an emotion to a scene rather than just head-on camera angles. So hell yes, I'm gonna give The Third Man stripes for that, because I know a lot of my suspense thrillers would be lacking if we hadn't discovered that the off-kilter lens is the way to go, right?
It's fascinating because it really is done in a different manner from something like a 12 Monkeys. There, the canted camera angles Gilliam was using really were meant to embolden and indemnify the air of insanity that was growing throughout the film. Here, these canted angles, to me at least, are a clue in that everybody in this film is in some way skewed or imperfect. It's viewing people through very stark contrasts in a way that I think is deeply interesting in a, technical respect. It's one of the reasons why it's so surprising that this film's journey after its creation was very odd almost. Would you believe, BK, that for a time, this film fell into the public domain following Selznick's death because no one thought to update the copyright? There was a time when this film was fair game for everybody. It was only after the Golan versus Holder case in the U.S. Supreme Court was settled in 2012 when it was decided that foreign works should have their copyrights extended as part of our treaty obligations as a country, despite language on the limits to domestic copyrights. So it was in the public domain, and now it is held under the British copyrights, but it was a work that fell into the public domain. It was a work that was not treated as valuable as a part of a library, which is such a shocking thing to me, because it really is, as you mentioned, stylistically, a bridge between classic Hollywood and the new style that was cropping up in Europe. You start to see the breaking of conventions. You start to see some jump cuts in here. You see those canted camera angles. You see Carol Reed working with available light, and you almost can look at Third Man as a case study of how the industry was going to shift and was shifting.
It's really cool to say that, and to see you point that out too, because my perspective of the industry is getting so robust because of these podcasts. I feel like I know shit now. Thank you, Jack. Now I'm the smart ass in the room when we're watching movies. But it is something that is cool. A lot of the older films, at least in my head, where I think of them. I haven't seen them, but you see clips, and you see clips in other movies of older films, and you can get an idea of like the feeling that they have. And with The Third Man, it really has all those things that really bridge that gap, like you were mentioning. It's not in the sense as traditional as you would think going into watching such a classical piece, especially something that's black and white. You're thinking it's going to be one thing. I was extremely impressed. I definitely think that this is something that is at best at what it does, if that makes sense. Like, there's nothing crazy or outlandish it does, but what it does try to accomplish as a film, it executes like perfectly. So I can see why people say it's a perfect movie. I can see that. Like, are there flaws? Like, I don't actually know, Jack.
But the real question is, BK, is it a perfect film for you? What is your rating for this masterpiece?
Oh, you gotta throw me on the bus like that off rip, Jack?
Of course I do. We rate everything.
All right, here we go. Okay, so look, I'm gonna give it to you straight. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna give it a solid 7.5. That's my rating. Here's why. Here's why. Yes, why so low, you may ask? It is true, so low for a near perfect film. I still argue that the pacing is a little bit slow. Like, maybe if it was a series, I would have been okay. Like, I don't know why this movie under 2 hours felt like it was a 3-hour movie. This movie's like an hour and 40-something minutes. I felt like we were watching it for 2 hours easily, and we weren't done with the film. So I'm not sure if that's something that's innate to these kinds of classic films, just because of like how they like to take their time. But you know me, I want to get it how I get it. I like it fast and swift, no pause. All right. So when it comes to these slow burns, which it is a slow burn. And it's odd because the slow burn doesn't start till a little bit into the film, and I think that's what got me mad. I'm a little jaded. They hooked me in so fast at the start, and then there was a slow burn, and I was like, why are you going to do that to me? Because now I'm going to want to look at my phone. I don't want to look at my phone. I want to pay attention. So that was my only big negative for me, just because I feel like when a film can lose you, it sucks. I feel like it's not necessarily doing its job right if it can lose the grippingness. But that is a hard thing to do when the plot should be gripping enough, and the execution is impeccable. There's so much that this film does right. Is it a film I'm going to watch again all the time? No. Will I watch it again if it's on? Absolutely. Like, where is TMC? Can we get this on rotation? I'm here to watch this at least once a year. Like, the film was solid. Now, that was me, Jack. I know it's probably a little low compared to you, so tell me, what is your film? Is it a 10 out of 10? What is the rating?
You know, it's funny. This is probably the most we've disagreed since Raiders.
Oh.
But I give Third Man a very solid and a very safe 9.5 on my rating. And here's why, BK. I totally understand the opinion you have about the way that the film can be a slow burn, the way that these black and white classics really can wear on you. Like, I'll give you, just so you know you're not alone on this, I'll give you a perfect example. My freshman year of film school, I kid you not, I fell asleep for about 10 minutes the first time I was ever shown Citizen Kane, which is like verboten among film people. But there was those moments that dragged for me as an 18-year-old kid, and I couldn't quite appreciate it the way that I go back and appreciate a film like Kane now. So I totally think it is legitimate to point out that things drag for our modern sensibility. What I will say in The Third Man's defense is that for its time period, it is an extremely economical story. It engrosses you with the individual details of what it's telling. It doesn't just ask you to focus on a spectacle. It really immerses you in that world. And furthermore, I think it's just an inborn bias for me, but I'm always willing to bump up classic films for the look, BK. Now, this is something that I think is really important. We discussed this after the film. I think that work on film is at its best when you're shooting with something like a 16mm or a 35mm or a 70mm print. I am not against films being shot digitally, but I think there is something to be said for the way that film stock preserves imperfection. And I think that beauty as a concept, for me at least, it really does have to have strangeness about its proportions. I want to see, the beauty of Alita Valley on a print, because through her imperfections, she shines out almost as more beautiful as that classic Hollywood actress. I want to see the contrasts and the imperfections of the film stock when Harry Lime is running through the sewers, and there are all these very stark blacks and whites, and it's hard to figure out where people are, where Lime is going. It builds this air of confusion. And I think with Third Man, it isn't just that the story is so good. It's that it is shot so well, in my opinion, as to embolden both the story and the world that is set in. So Third Man comes in at a solid 9.5 for me.
Well, that whole resting monologue hype session, I'm over here like, all right, maybe an extra 0.5, maybe an extra 0.5 for style, because I agree with you. I really do think it's execution. Like I said, what it does very, very well.
I mean, I'm pretentious, but I don't want everything to look like a Marvel film. That's just me.
Exactly, and that's super fair. I think we can both agree on what we like about it is that. I think the style of it, like this is something I'd watch to digest that vibe. It really encapsulates not just a time period historically of its nature and plot, but also of filmmaking. It really does become this beacon of that time period in film history, and it is such a good watch. I understand your rating. It is very high. I like a 9.5. I think that is very strong. And I think my rating for the 7.5 is not necessarily that it's bad. It's me. I always have a lesson filter for the ones that are slow burns. Unfortunately, I'm getting better at it. I will become patient. I am telling you, one day.
And in total fairness, this is very much more in line with what my sensibilities are as an enjoyer of film, which is one of the reasons why I think next week is going to be equally as interesting, because we're going from my sensibility far into your sensibility, because we're going into some modern animation work that, of course, I have no familiarity with, but is right up your street. So what have we got for them next week, BK?
Yes. I'm so excited to talk about what we've got in the pipeline for next week. So here it is. You know it as the extraordinary 2016 Disney animated film Zootopia. Yes! I'm so hyped to watch this. I love how this film really tackles the conversation of prejudice and things like that, and discrimination and stereotypes. I think it's super timely to talk about it. Also, it's been a minute since we've done animation, so you know your girl's gonna pull it up. But we're going to shine some amazing light on the director Brian Howard, who's done Bolt and Tangled, as well as the team from Wreck-It Ralph, Rich Moore, and screenplay writer Phil Johnson, who is amazing, and also Jared Butch, who did work on Moana. So some of the legendary, more recent contemporary Disney faves that we like. I know we've got a little tea on Disney, but I like to shine light on the creatives that do amazing work outside of that and work within Disney's crazy limitations. So we've got awesome stories, shit Jack doesn't know, and shit BK knows. So let's go.
You've been dying to turn the tables on me with animation for a minute. But no, I think it's interesting. Like I haven't avoided the modern Pixar films. Like it's not like it's something that is completely verboten to me, but I just really genuinely haven't sat down and watched really any animated work for Disney since I think Toy Story 3 came out. So it's going to be an induction for me into a full decade of animation that I just have no familiarity with. Like, if I think about the last CGI animated movie I've seen, I think it might be like the Bee Movie, which, I watched for the lulz. So, like, it's going to be a fun experience for me, BK, because I'm ready to be out of my comfort zone and to learn a little bit of the knowledge you got to spit on this.
Hell yes. Zootopia is such a great work to tackle a lot of things. Also, Judy Hopps is an amazing female protagonist. We're working our way into those March months, so we always want to shine light on our lovely ladies in film. So I give that to her. And the animation work on this is impeccable. There's a lot of talks about 3D modeling and cool things, which we haven't really explored on the pod yet. So I'm excited to get into that lane of animation. So it's going to be super
And now
dope.
I am too. Because it sounds like it's kind of the perfect bridge between Black History Month and Women's History Month because of the fact that it's got this female protagonist and focuses so clearly on racial issues through the film. I know about it that much. I know that that's the subject matter. So I think we, kind of nailed it with this choice for next week. So I think that is going to end up being just a whole lot of fun for us and a whole lot of fun for you listening to us.
Absolutely. You guys buckle up. If you're ahead of the game, be sure to rewatch Zootopia, all right? It's on there. You Disney Plus fans there. Again, hashtag not sponsored, but love it when you guys watch the films ahead of time to join us with the pod debrief. And you know where you can find us, not on Spotify, but into the interwebs and on the social medias. We are at RFN_podcast on Twitter and also on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. So if you give some love, if you live on those platforms, hit us with a follow, hit it with a quick little like, and share us some love. We hope you can find us here again on Revenge of the Film Nerds next week for an amazing next episode.
I'm BK. I'm really very excited for it, and keep supporting us, folks. Keep finding us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, on Stitcher, on Podcast Addict. Basically, wherever your podcasts are distributed. We love bringing this to you every week, and I am so pleased that we are getting far into this season and making that headway, BK.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know me, BK. I'm out here on Twitch, on Twitter, on the gram, at Black Crystal. But Jack, where can the homies find you and all the work you're doing out here as well?
They're going to find me on Instagram and on Twitter at ManlyJackManly. They're going to find me on Twitch and on Discord at A Waste of Space. That is my gamer tag. And I am going to be bringing more content to you as 2021 unfolds. It's time for the comeback, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's go. We love to see it. So please support the fam. You out there. Check us out. Let us know if there are any movies you want us to check out. If anything is on your watch list, we'd love to get into the rotation going forward. That's it from us. This was Revenge of the Film Nerds. I'm BK.
And I am Manly Jack Manly, the manly man who does those things that no man can. Thank you so much for listening, folks.
Have a good one. Janet.